The cold morning mist clung to the Volga River like the breath of the dead. Pulled his cloak tighter as he watched the most horrifying spectacle of his diplomatic journey. The year was 922, and this Arab traveler had come far from Baghdad, expecting to witness exotic customs among the Rus Vikings. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life, becoming the only eyewitness account of a practice so brutal that even hardened warriors would whisper about it in hushed tones. The chieftain's body lay cold and stiff in a temporary grave waiting for 10 days, while his people prepared for a funeral that would shake the very foundations of human decency. But it wasn't the dead man who would suffer the most in this ritual. It was a young slave girl who had volunteered to join her master in death, not knowing the true horror that awaited her. Viking funeral practices were never simple affairs. These Norse seafarers, who had terrorized Europe's coasts for centuries, believed that death was merely a doorway to another realm. The wealthy and powerful needed to cross this threshold with all the trappings of their earthly status intact. Ships became their vessels to the afterlife, loaded with weapons, jewelry, food, and most disturbingly, human companions who would serve them in death as they had in life. The practice of human sacrifice in Viking funerals wasn't born from mere cruelty, though cruelty it certainly was. It stemmed from a worldview where the social hierarchy extended beyond the grave. Thralls as slaves were called in Old Norse, were considered property no different from livestock or tools. When a master died, his most valuable possessions accompanied him, and sometimes that included the people who had served him. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia tells a grim story. In Flakstad, Norway, researchers uncovered graves containing multiple bodies, some decapitated and buried alongside their masters. Chemical analysis of the bones revealed that the beheaded victims had eaten vastly different diets from those they were buried with, suggesting they came from different social classes entirely. These weren't fallen warriors given honorable burials, but slaves sacrificed as grave goods. The young woman who volunteered to die with the Rus chieftain had no idea what she was truly agreeing to. For 10 days, she was treated like royalty, elevated above her usual station as a thrall. She was given fine clothes, abundant food and drink, and was attended by servants. The other Vikings called her the dead man's bride, and she was told she would join him in a paradise beyond death. But this elevation was merely the calm before a storm of unimaginable brutality. The woman overseeing the ceremony, whom Ibn Fadlan called the Angel of Death, was preparing something far more sinister than a peaceful transition to the afterlife. This title would prove to be grimly prophetic, as this woman would orchestrate one of the most savage rituals ever recorded in human history. During those 10 days of preparation, the slave girl was required to visit each tent in the Viking camp. What happened in those tents was part of the ritual, but it was also a preview of the violence to come. The men she visited would tell her to inform her master that they had done right by him, believing that their actions would somehow transfer life force to the dead chieftain. The girl, intoxicated and confused by the strong drink she was constantly given, likely didn't understand that she was being prepared for slaughter. The ship that would serve as the chieftain's final resting place was dragged onto land, a massive vessel that had once carried these warriors across treacherous seas to raid distant shores. Now it would become a funeral pyre, but not before it witnessed acts that would make even the most hardened Viking warrior uncomfortable. The ship was more than just a means of transportation in Viking culture. It was a symbol of power, freedom, and the journey between worlds. As the 10th day dawned, the true horror began to unfold. The chieftain's body was exhumed from its temporary grave and carried to the ship with great ceremony. He was dressed in new clothes, surrounded by weapons that had served him in life, and positioned as if he were merely sleeping. Around him, his people placed the treasures he would need in the afterlife: silver arm, rings, finely crafted swords, and ornate drinking horns. But the most valuable grave goods were yet to come. Animals were brought forward for sacrifice, their blood spattering the participants in a ritual that was both religious ceremony and public spectacle. Horses, dogs, chickens, and cattle were slaughtered, their bodies arranged around the ship. The Vikings believed that these animals would serve their master in the next world just as they had in this one. The slave girl watched these preparations with growing unease. The strong drink that had been her constant companion for 10 days was affecting her judgment, but she was beginning to sense that something was terribly wrong. When she was told to approach the ship where her master lay, her reluctance became apparent to everyone present. What happened next would be seared into Ibn Fadlan's memory forever. The angel of death, the woman who had been orchestrating this macabre theater, grabbed the slave girl as she hesitated. The girl's screams pierced the morning air as 6 men seized her, and what followed was an act of such savage brutality that it defied comprehension. The sexual violence that preceded the girl's death wasn't random cruelty, but part of the ritual itself. The Vikings believed that this act would somehow bind her to her master and ensure her loyalty in the afterlife. It was a perversion of the marriage ceremony, a forced union that would continue beyond death. The men who participated weren't acting out of personal desire, but fulfilling what they saw as a religious obligation. As the girl's screams echoed across the water, 4 of the men held her down, while the others completed the ritual rape. Then, as she lay broken and terrified, they began the final act of this horrific ceremony. A rope was placed around her neck, and while 4 men pulled it tight, the angel of death repeatedly stabbed her in the chest with a dagger. The combination of strangulation and stabbing ensured that the girl's death was neither quick nor merciful. The Vikings believed that the violence of her death would somehow strengthen her spirit for the journey ahead, making her a more valuable companion for her master. It was a logic that made sense only within the brutal worldview of a society that saw human life as a commodity to be traded, used, and discarded. Ibn Fadlan, watching from a safe distance, was horrified by what he witnessed. As a man from a sophisticated Islamic civilization, he had seen violence and death, but nothing had prepared him for this systematic brutality carried out in the name of religion. His account would become the only detailed description of such a ceremony preserved for posterity as a testament to the darkest aspects of Viking culture. The girl's body was placed beside her master on the ship, arranged as if she were sleeping peacefully, rather than murdered in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Her jewelry, which had been removed during the ceremony, was scattered around her as grave goods. To the Vikings present, she was no longer a person, but a possession valuable only for what she could provide to her master in death. The ship was then set to blaze, the flames consuming the chieftain, his slave, and all the treasures that surrounded them. As the fire roared skyward, the Vikings believed they were witnessing the dead man's journey to Valhalla, or whatever afterlife awaited him. The smoke that rose from the burning ship was thought to carry the souls of the dead to their final destination. But for the slave girl, there had been no choice in this journey. She had volunteered for what she thought would be an honor, only to discover too late that she had signed her own death warrant. Her fate was sealed not by her own decisions, but by a culture that saw her as nothing more than property to be disposed of at her master's convenience. The practice of sacrificing slaves at Viking funerals wasn't limited to this single well-documented case. Archaeological evidence suggests that human sacrifice was a regular feature of high-status burials throughout the Viking world. The famous ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway contained evidence of sacrificed animals, and while human remains are less well preserved, historical sources suggest that human sacrifice was common at such ceremonies. The flames that consumed the ship on the Volga were not unique in Viking history. Across the Norse world, from the fjords of Norway to the trading posts of Russia, similar scenes played out whenever a person of importance died. The practice was so ingrained in Viking culture that it appeared in their most sacred texts and was considered as natural as breathing. Yet for the slaves who found themselves chosen for these ceremonies, it represented the ultimate expression of their powerlessness in a society that valued them less than livestock. The selection process for human sacrifice varied from place to place, but it always involved a grotesque parody of choice. Sometimes slaves volunteered as the girl on the Volga had done, lured by promises of honor and eternal service to a beloved master. Other times, the choice was made for them by lot or by the whim of the deceased's family. In either case, once selected, there was no escape. The Vikings saw the sacrifice as a sacred duty, and anyone who tried to prevent it would face the wrath of both the living and the dead. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia have revealed the true scope of this practice. At Birka, Sweden's most important Viking trading center, researchers have uncovered graves that tell stories of systematic violence. One burial contained the remains of a wealthy merchant surrounded by his possessions, including what appeared to be two young women who had been killed specifically for the funeral. Chemical analysis of their bones showed they had lived on a diet of fish and barley typical of slaves, while the man they accompanied had eaten meat and dairy products regularly. The positioning of these bodies was particularly telling. The women had been arranged carefully around their master, their arms positioned as if they were serving him, even in death. One held what appeared to be the remains of a drinking horn, while the other was positioned near his feet. Their skulls showed evidence of blunt force trauma, suggesting they had been killed quickly and efficiently, perhaps as a mercy compared to the prolonged torture witnessed by Ibn Fadlan. But not all sacrificial victims were granted such a relatively quick death. At Flakstad in Norway, archaeologists discovered a burial that revealed the full horror of Viking funeral practices. The grave contained a powerful chieftain, surrounded by his weapons and jewelry, but also the remains of a young man who had clearly suffered before his death. The victim's bones showed evidence of prolonged torture with cuts and breaks that could only have been inflicted while he was still alive. The young man's skull had been crushed, but not before he had endured what appeared to be ritual mutilation. His fingers had been broken one by one, and there were cut marks on his ribs that suggested he had been slowly flayed. The Vikings believed that the suffering of the sacrifice would somehow transfer strength to the dead master, making the victim's agony a necessary part of the ceremony. This belief in the power of suffering was deeply rooted in Norse mythology. The god Odin himself had sacrificed himself hanging from the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain wisdom and power. If the king of the gods could gain strength through suffering, then surely a mortal master could benefit from the agony of his slaves. It was a logic that justified the most extreme cruelty as a religious necessity. The ships used for these funeral pyres were often the most magnificent vessels in a chieftain's fleet. These weren't just any boats, but the longships that had carried Vikings across the North Sea to raid the monasteries of England and Ireland. Each ship represented years of craftsmanship and enormous wealth, making their destruction in funeral fires a display of power that few could afford. Only the most important Vikings received ship burials, and only the wealthiest could afford to sacrifice multiple humans along with their vessels. The famous ship burial at Oseberg, discovered in 1904, provides insight into the scale of these ceremonies. The ship itself was a masterpiece of Viking craftsmanship, over 70 feet long, and decorated with intricate carvings that told stories of gods and heroes. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of 2 women, one elderly and one younger, surrounded by an incredible array of grave goods, including sleds, a cart, textiles, and even kitchen utensils. While the identity of these women remains debated, many scholars believe one was a queen or powerful noblewoman, while the other was a slave sacrificed to serve her in the afterlife. The younger woman's skeleton showed signs of a violent death, with damage to her skull that suggested she had been killed specifically for the burial. Her position in the grave, curled up at the feet of the older woman, reinforced the idea that she was there to serve rather than to be honored. The Gokstad ship burial discovered in 1880 told a similar story. The massive ship contained the remains of a powerful chieftain, along with 12 horses, 6 dogs, and a peacock. But it also contained evidence of human sacrifice that was carefully hidden from early archaeologists. Recent re-examination of the bones found at the site has revealed fragments that appear to be from at least 2 additional humans, likely slaves, who were killed and then dismembered to fit into the burial chamber. The dismemberment of sacrificial victims wasn't uncommon in Viking funeral practices. Sometimes it was done for practical reasons, to fit more bodies into a confined space, but often it served a ritual purpose. The Vikings believed that breaking apart the bodies of slaves would prevent their spirits from becoming too powerful in the afterlife, ensuring they remained subservient to their masters even in death. This fear of rebellious slave spirits led to increasingly elaborate methods of ensuring their compliance. Some victims were buried with iron chains still attached to their bones, suggesting they had been bound not just in life, but for eternity. Others were found with their heads separated from their bodies and placed between their legs, a practice that was thought to confuse the spirit and prevent it from finding its way to power in the afterlife. The psychological impact of these practices on the living slave population was enormous. Every thrall knew that their death might not bring freedom, but rather an eternity of service to a master they might have hated in life. This knowledge was a powerful tool of control, ensuring that slaves remained obedient not just out of fear of immediate punishment, but out of terror of what might await them after death. The ceremonies themselves were designed to reinforce these fears. Slaves were often forced to watch the sacrificial rituals, seeing firsthand what fate might await them. The prolonged nature of many sacrifices with victims kept alive for days or even weeks before their deaths served as a constant reminder of the master's power over life and death. It was psychological warfare conducted on a spiritual level. The role of the angel of death figure, like the woman Ibn Fadlan described, was crucial to these ceremonies. These were typically older women who had gained respect and authority within Viking society, often through their knowledge of religious rituals and their willingness to carry out the most brutal aspects of the ceremonies. They were the ones who decided how the sacrifices would die, and they took pride in their ability to orchestrate elaborate displays of violence. These women weren't acting out of personal cruelty, but out of genuine religious conviction. They believed that their actions were necessary to ensure the proper transition of the dead to the afterlife, and that any mercy shown to the sacrificial victims would weaken the ceremony's effectiveness. Their role was similar to that of executioners in other cultures, carrying out society's will, even when it required them to commit acts that would be considered monstrous in other contexts. The training required to become an angel of death was extensive and secretive. Young women who showed aptitude for the role were taught not just the technical aspects of killing, but the religious significance of every cut, every scream, and every drop of blood. They learned to read the signs that would tell them when a victim had suffered enough to satisfy the gods and when more pain was required to ensure the ceremony's success. The tools used in these sacrifices were often specially crafted for the purpose. Archaeological finds have uncovered knives and other implements that show signs of repeated use in violent contexts, with edges worn smooth from cutting through bone and flesh. These weren't weapons of war, but instruments of religious ceremony, as carefully maintained and revered as any priest's chalice or altar cloth. The timing of the sacrifices was also carefully calculated. The Vikings believed that certain phases of the moon and certain times of year were more auspicious for sending souls to the afterlife. Winter solstice was particularly favored as it represented the death of the old year and the birth of the new. The long nights provided cover for ceremonies that the Vikings preferred to conduct away from the eyes of outsiders. though they had no shame about their practices within their own communities. The practice of burying slaves alive with their masters reached its most horrifying extremes in the remote settlements of Iceland and Greenland, where isolation and harsh conditions created a culture of desperation that pushed Viking funeral customs to their darkest limits. Here, far from the moderating influences of more established societies, the line between religious ceremony and sadistic torture became increasingly blurred, creating rituals that would have shocked even the hardened warriors of mainland Scandinavia. In these frontier communities, slaves were often the most valuable possessions a family could own, more precious than gold or silver, in lands where survival depended on every pair of working hands. Yet paradoxically, this very value made their sacrifice even more meaningful in the eyes of their masters. To kill a slave worth a year's harvest was to make a statement about the deceased's importance that no amount of buried treasure could match. The Greenland settlements, established by Eric the Red and his followers in the late 10th century, developed particularly elaborate burial customs that reflected their precarious existence on the edge of the known world. Archaeological evidence from the eastern settlement suggests that human sacrifice became more common as the colony struggled with climate change and resource depletion. The colder temperatures that began in the 13th century made survival increasingly difficult, and the Vikings responded by intensifying their religious practices, believing that more elaborate sacrifices might appease the gods and restore their fortunes. One burial site near Brattahlid, Eric the Red's own settlement, contained evidence of a ceremony that defied comprehension even by Viking standards. The grave held the remains of a wealthy farmer, surrounded by his most prized possessions, but also the bodies of what appeared to be an entire household of slaves. Men, women, and children had been killed and arranged around their master in a grotesque tableau that suggested they had been forced to maintain their living relationships even in death. The children's remains were particularly disturbing. Chemical analysis revealed that they had been drugged before their deaths, likely with a mixture of herbs and alcohol that would have left them conscious but unable to resist. Their positioning in the grave suggested they had been buried alive, placed in small chambers carved into the frozen ground, where they would have slowly suffocated as the earth was piled on top of them. The Vikings believed that children's souls were more easily controlled than those of adults, making them ideal servants for the afterlife. The adult slaves in this burial showed evidence of having been tortured before their deaths, but in ways that were carefully calculated to keep them alive as long as possible. Their bones bore the marks of systematic mutilation, with fingers and toes removed one by one over what must have been days or weeks. The Vikings had developed techniques for inflicting maximum pain while preventing death, using their knowledge of anatomy gained from years of warfare to prolong their victims' suffering. The sexual violence that accompanied these ceremonies was not limited to women. Male slaves were often subjected to ritual castration and other forms of sexual mutilation that served both to humiliate them and to ensure their continued subservience in the afterlife. The Vikings believed that removing a man's sexual organs would prevent him from challenging his master's authority in death, reducing him to the status of a eunuch who could serve but never rule. The psychological preparation of sacrificial victims became an art form in these isolated communities. Slaves chosen for sacrifice were often subjected to months of conditioning designed to break their will and ensure their compliance. They were alternately pampered and tortured, given hope, and then having it cruelly snatched away until they became completely dependent on their captors for any sense of reality or purpose. This conditioning process often involved elaborate deceptions designed to make the victims believe they were being honored rather than prepared for slaughter. Chosen slaves might be told they were being elevated to the status of concubines or adopted family members, only to discover the truth when it was too late to resist. The psychological cruelty of these deceptions was considered as important as the physical torture that followed, as it ensured that the victims would carry their despair and confusion into the afterlife. The role of other slaves in these ceremonies was particularly cruel. Those not chosen for sacrifice were often forced to participate in the torture and killing of their fellow thralls, creating bonds of complicity that made rebellion even more unlikely. A slave who had helped kill another slave could never be trusted by his fellows, ensuring his continued isolation and dependence on his masters. This divide and conquer strategy was so effective that recorded slave uprisings in Viking societies were extremely rare. The ships used for the most elaborate funeral pyres were often modified specifically for the ceremony, with special chambers built to hold the sacrificial victims. These chambers were designed to be partially sealed, allowing the occupants to remain alive during the early stages of the burning while slowly succumbing to smoke and heat. The Vikings believed that the victims' screams and struggles would help guide their master's soul to the afterlife, making their prolonged agony a necessary part of the ritual. Archaeological evidence from Denmark has revealed ship burials where the sacrificial chambers were equipped with air holes that could be gradually sealed as the ceremony progressed. This allowed the ceremony's organizers to control exactly when and how the victims died, timing their deaths to coincide with specific parts of the ritual. The level of planning and engineering required for such elaborate torture devices demonstrates the central importance of human sacrifice in Viking funeral customs. The influence of these practices extended far beyond the Viking world itself. Arab traders who encountered the Rus along the river routes of Eastern Europe carried tales of their brutal customs back to the Islamic world, where they were recorded by historians and geographers. These accounts, while often dismissed as exaggerations by later scholars, have been largely confirmed by archaeological evidence that reveals the true scope of Viking funeral violence. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity in the 11th and 12th centuries brought an official end to human sacrifice, but the practice continued in secret for generations. Christian missionaries reported encountering communities that still practiced the old ways, burying slaves with their masters despite the new religion's prohibition on such customs. The transition was gradual and often incomplete, with many Vikings adopting Christian burial practices for their public ceremonies while maintaining older traditions in private. The last recorded instance of Viking human sacrifice occurred in Sweden in the late 12th century, when a powerful jarl was buried with his entire household of slaves, despite the official Christianization of the country. The ceremony was conducted in secret, away from the eyes of Christian authorities, but word of it eventually reached the church hierarchy and resulted in severe punishments for those involved. This incident marked the end of an era, but it also demonstrated how deeply ingrained these practices had become in Viking culture. The psychological legacy of these practices extended far beyond their official abandonment. The descendants of Viking slaves carried the trauma of their ancestors' experiences for generations, and the fear of being buried alive with their masters influenced their behavior long after the practice had ended. Even today, archaeological discoveries of Viking burial sites can reveal the extent of this trauma, with evidence of desperate attempts by victims to escape their fate even after being sealed in their graves. Modern forensic analysis has revealed details about these burial practices that would have been impossible to detect with earlier archaeological methods. DNA analysis can now determine family relationships between victims and their masters, revealing that some sacrificial victims were the children or relatives of the deceased rather than unrelated slaves. This suggests that the practice of human sacrifice was even more complex and disturbing than previously understood, involving not just the killing of property, but the murder of family members who were considered expendable. The ships that served as funeral pyres have been found to contain evidence of multiple burial episodes, suggesting that some vessels were used repeatedly for different ceremonies before finally being burned. These ships became floating charnel houses, accumulating layers of human remains over months or years before their final destruction. The psychological impact on the communities that witnessed these repeated ceremonies must have been enormous, creating a culture where death and violence were normalized to an extraordinary degree. The end of the Viking Age brought an official close to these practices, but their influence on Scandinavian culture persisted for centuries. Folk tales and legends preserved memories of the old customs, often romanticizing them as heroic traditions rather than acknowledging their brutal reality. It was only with the development of modern archaeology and forensic science that the true horror of Viking funeral practices began to be understood and documented. Today, the archaeological evidence of Viking human sacrifice serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty when it is sanctioned by religious belief and social custom. The slaves who were buried alive in ships, tortured to death in elaborate ceremonies, and sacrificed to serve masters they may have hated represent some of history's most forgotten victims. Their stories, preserved in bone and ash, continue to emerge from the ground as archaeologists uncover the dark secrets of the Viking Age. The legacy of these practices extends beyond historical curiosity to raise fundamental questions about the nature of power, religion, and human dignity. The Vikings who participated in these ceremonies were not monsters, but ordinary people who had been conditioned by their culture to accept extraordinary cruelty as normal and necessary. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the human capacity for evil when it is dressed in the robes of tradition and sanctified by religious belief.